that's what's so cool about him, honestly, is that everyone who's like posting on Facebook and stuff like that, even people who barely knew him, there's just something about his music and about just his presence that it's really deeply impactful. And I think that that's amazing. Actually, I think most people felt like they knew him, even if they didn't, because I think he made himself available. Actually.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer, and this is episode 21. This is a very special bonus episode. I'm recording this Wednesday, August 9th, just about 2 days after the passing of composer David Maslanka. First of all, my most sincere condolences to David's family, his close friends, and those who knew him the best. It's a tremendous loss to the band community. He was a remarkable composer and an even more remarkable man. I had the good fortune about 2 years ago to spend an afternoon with David. He gave me an hour of his time at a point in my life where I was questioning what I wanted to do with my career as a composer. And he listened patiently while he was having his lunch. And at the conclusion of my almost talking for an hour, he gave me some thoughtful words and some advice, and I've been holding that advice close to my heart ever since, and it's made an impact on my life. Here in the St. Louis area, we're very fortunate to have a composer named Christopher Stark who teaches at Washington University. Chris is an amazing composer. He's got a big career and a bright future ahead of him. And Chris got his undergraduate degree at the University of Montana, and after completing his undergraduate degree and before he went to graduate school, Chris called David Maslanka on the phone and asked him if he would teach him composition lessons for that year that he was applying for graduate schools. David agreed, and the rest is history. Chris has gone on to get a doctorate from Cornell and is now a college professor. So I asked Chris to be on the show to talk about his time studying with David. You know, the Monday after hearing about David's passing, like many out there, I was struck by how important he was and how much he meant. And so I went and listened to his music all day. And I wasn't sure how to respond. It didn't seem right. I didn't know David very well. And so it didn't seem right for me to come on and talk about him. And so knowing Chris and having Chris come on seems like a nice way to honor David in the way that I can on this podcast. And so I hope you enjoy the conversation. Now, onto the episode. Hi, Chris.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. So I'm going to sort of let the listeners know why we're chatting. You're a composer of music for all sorts of genres, and you've had a lot of recent success, but you're not particularly a band composer. But you do have a connection to the sad news this week of David Maslanka's passing, is that you studied with David. You're from Montana.
Yeah, that's right. Worked with David after I had finished my undergraduate. I think David made it fairly well known that he was living in Montana. I think a lot of people knew that. It was kind of a cool part of his existence as a composer, was that he's kind of lived in this remote place, which was also obviously a huge boon to us people who grew up in Montana to have someone of that stature in our community. But yeah, I finished my undergraduate, which at the University of Montana, where he didn't teach. He was completely independent. And when I finished, I just asked him, called him up, literally looked his name up in the phone book and called him up and said, I'd love to take lessons with you. And being the incredibly generous and serious person that he was, he took me on as a student. And I took a year off from college at that point and studied with him before I went to Cincinnati for my master's degree. But yeah, we can talk about that.
Yeah. So what's your instrument, Chris?
So in college, I studied trombone the most seriously. That was my kind of like weekly lesson instrument. I also took some lessons on the guitar in my last year or two. I probably would have studied guitar had there been a guitar teacher when I showed up at the University of Montana, but they hired somebody in my last year of study there that the orchestra director took on the responsibilities of teaching guitar. So I took lessons with them at the very end, but most seriously probably was trombone.
Yeah. Did you play any of David's music while you were in school?
Yeah, I'm trying to think what I played. So because he was there in the community and because our band director, a guy by the name of Steve Bolstad, who now is the director at James Madison University, had written his dissertation on his Fourth Symphony and was a very good friend of his and serious champion of his music. There was always some of his music being played at the University of Montana. So I'm trying to think of things like, of course, the Fourth Symphony, In Memoriam. What other pieces? This would have been, the late '90s, early 2000s, before some of his other pieces that get played a lot now. But yeah, I know when I was studying with him, he was writing his Seventh Symphony.
Yeah, you and I spoke a little bit before the interview started about David, and I only had an hour of his time, and it was an exceptional hour. And I think it was Michael Markowski, the band composer, who mentioned that David was fond of saying that people seem to find him and his music at crossroads in their lives.
Absolutely. That's definitely true.
What was the quality, as a student, what were the qualities that sort of fostered that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've been thinking about this a lot too, actually, because his music, he has like a very sort of intense following among college-age kids and directors of college ensembles. And I don't know. I mean, obviously, one of those reasons is that the music is really intense and very serious and difficult. And so when people perform it, it takes a lot of effort, and it's an effort that they feel is worthwhile because they feel, I think, transformed after they've played his music. And there are not a lot of pieces, I think, or composers who sort of take on the wind ensemble as their kind of primary way of expressing themselves and then write these 30, 40, I mean, gosh, the last 10 years, I feel like he was writing pieces that are like an hour plus for the wind ensemble, which is something, like the type of undertaking that, Beethoven or Brahms would have taken on with the piano sonata or the string quartet or the symphony orchestra. And so there was something about the seriousness of which he, approached the wind ensemble that I don't think really anybody had before him to that extent, that gave it some gravitas, and especially for students in college. I mean, there's also the element that the wind ensemble is sort of a college ensemble. That seems to be where it exists the most prominently. And so students are obviously between the ages of, 18 and 25 or something. And so that's when they're going to encounter his music the most. And so it does find them obviously at that point in which they're transforming their lives into being professionals. But all that aside, I think there's just a heaviness to his work, and there's a seriousness to it. And anybody who ever knew him knows how serious he was. It's immediately apparent. He's one of those people that just is authentic through and through, and you immediately pick that up from the first minute that you talk to him.
What about his style do you think was unique to him?
So, I mean, that's a good question because it's hard to decipher. I mean, many people, I think, on the surface might say that his music was sort of neoclassical or neo-romantic, maybe even contained some elements of minimalism and, 20th century kind of romantic threads. But I think there was something much more unique than that. And the only thing I usually associate it with his practice of meditation and Buddhism and searching for these kind of very deep, universal kind of feelings that seem to transcend the style. And I think that's what made his music so interesting, was that he was sort of chasing that sort of profundity or something rather than chasing style, if that makes sense.
It does make a lot of sense. I have several thoughts that come out of this. I want to return to the notion of style, but I want to talk about the spirituality for a moment, because he's obviously a very spiritual man. And as you said earlier, anyone who met him for just a moment knew that. He wrote lots of music based on hymns and chorales, and he told me that he keeps a book of chorales, and every morning of his life he would sit down and play through some chorales. And so do you have any insight as a student about that aspect of his output or his style?
Yeah, so I can tell you what I remember. He absolutely loved writing those Bach chorales. He would write in the style of Bach constantly. I remember seeing to set the stage of like, first of all, his studio, which was really unique as well, was he lived kind of on the outskirts of Missoula, Montana. And there was when you pulled up to his house, there was pastures with horses and donkeys, and there was sort of animals surrounding you. And I don't know if this ever changed. I mean, this was about 10 years ago, but he had this small, kind of, I don't know how to describe it, studio shack, something that was in the middle of the pasture, actually. And inside of it was his stuff, like an upright piano. There was a table that he had all of his manuscript on. There was stacks and stacks and stacks of manuscript and things around, some space heaters. Very actually kind of humble space. And I just remember seeing stacks and stacks and stacks of chorale style writing in the style of Bach on hymn tunes that he would do. And I think for me, that was left an impression because it was this discipline of practice, which I don't think many composers think about, the idea of practicing. I think many composers think about sketching or obviously composing, but he actually practiced in another style things that obviously, his work, he did have these things show up in his work, these chorales and things like that, but it wasn't necessarily for the end result of having it be part of his music, but it was to be a better composer. And I think that act was very spiritual, it seemed to me, for him to have this kind of disciplined, almost like religious devotion to work. I can recall that when this is the first time that I really found out what it meant to be a professional composer. As I did some work for a week, from one week to another in a lesson, and I came back, and I had a few pieces of manuscript paper, I had some melodies and some chord progressions and some ideas about this piece I was going to write. And then he, showed me that he had orchestrated, 100 pages of manuscript or something like that in the past week. And I thought, okay, so you wrote 100 pages of band music, and I wrote, like 3 motives or something like that. Yeah. But that's because he was so incredibly dedicated to the art of composition. In a really kind of old school way that you don't encounter that frequently.
There's a podcast run by Garrett Hope called The Portfolio Composer. And Garrett interviews lots of composers, and he talks to them about business practices. And Matt and David Maslanka were on Garrett's show. And the theme of the show was David saying of just show up, do the work. And that seems to be something that he really believed in and passed along.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, we had some hard conversations as well, of him, saying like, you have to be more serious about this. And, kind of one of those, when are you going to take this more seriously sort of attitudes. But it was always in an encouraging way. There was never any time that I ever worked with him where I felt that it was discouraging, even though he was being very serious about me not being serious enough.
Uh-huh. Yeah. He was a remarkable man.
Yeah.
I want to go back to that discussion of style. And, he has very unique little fingerprints on his music. When I listen to a piece by him, I know exactly who it is immediately. There's little rhythmic figures and little passages that recur throughout his music. To me, as another composer, it's very difficult to write for band for a variety of reasons. Especially if you're writing for school ensembles, the ensemble sort of demands certain styles out of you or certain things. But with David and with a few other notable composers, he seemed to bend the band to his style as opposed to bending his style to the band. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good or an interesting thought. He definitely wrote really difficult music for the band. I mean, anybody who's played his pieces knows how hard they are. But he somehow, and I think this is true probably of any style or composition, or if you're very serious, or that the people that are playing it can see that there is a transformative experience to be had by trying to reach these sort of difficult heights. I think that people are willing to and actually want to be challenged in that way. In order to achieve that kind of experience. And I think again, I think that's one of the reasons that makes his music so special, is that he demands that players go after that, and so that they feel, even if they don't get there, that they've attempted something worthwhile and something profound. But as for his style bending to the band, I think he's one of the best composers for the band as far as just making the band sound good. I mean, many people who dabble, such as myself, in the wind ensemble find it a very complex and very difficult medium to compose for, mainly for balance reasons and things like that. And I think because he took the medium on so seriously, that he actually was able to, I think, really develop or really speak its language in a way that many composers never figure out, just because they don't spend the time trying to figure it out. But yeah, I think though the style, because he's a composer whose rhythms and harmonies and melodies work, I think that they could probably be played in any medium and they would still work. They would still make sense. And I think that's also back to his study of Bach and these sorts of things, where Bach can be played basically on any instruments and it still sounds good. And that's because all the notes and rhythms make sense together. And I think that's something that he also would strive for. I mean, of course, then he had the things where the clarinets are playing with, using their fingers to change the pitch and stuff like that. So there are, these effects in there that couldn't be done on other instruments. But I think that's going after that sort of rigor of harmony and melody and stuff like that helped it speak through the band.
What impact on your career? Now, you've had many great teachers and you've had a career that's sort of burgeoning as we speak. What lessons did he specifically teach you beyond the work ethic? Is there anything musical or spiritual, maybe? I don't know what I'm asking here. What did you get from him beyond that work ethic?
Sure. So the work ethic, I think, is the most important. But let's see, the other things that I really remember was, one, he kind of gave me a feeling of, there's this anxiety that a lot of composers have with being contemporary. And I think he told me, this is not something that he suffered from. And he told me, if you're writing a piece of music right now, then by definition, it's contemporary. And that was basically the end of that discussion. And really, I found that to mean, you have to be yourself, write the music that you want to write, and don't worry about what anybody else thinks about it. But that was really part of his kind of incredible selflessness and egoless nature, that I think our egos are what make us want to be contemporary, and not the reality of our authenticity or our hearts or whatever it is that we want to say. So I found that to be something that I really took from those lessons, was just basically trying to be yourself. And the other thing that I got from him was, he had actually sort of his music has, I would call maybe kind of like a surrealist streak, and maybe even, people now might call it postmodern or something, in which he told me to not worry about whether ideas fit together into the same piece, because he really believed in this kind of subconscious concept that if there are these ideas that are sort of continually bubbling to the surface while you're in your creative process, and whether those ideas, sometimes we think, like, how could it possibly be that I'm hearing on one side like a jazz drummer, and on the other side of my brain hearing, like a Bach chorale? How can these two things possibly exist in the same piece? They seem to be coming from completely different parts of my personality. And he sort of encouraged me that if that's the case, then your subconscious is sort of trying to tell you that these things belong together, and not to worry about whether something belongs or not in the piece. Sort of to like let things just sort of flow into the music. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that very well, but
no, I understand it completely. I think it's
and
great.
So he would write in his music. It does that. There are sometimes these crazy elements that sort of appear and go away, and I think that's the kind of eccentricity that I really love about his music, and that I loved about him. So those are probably the two biggest things. And I suppose both those things are just ways of trying to get a young composer to free up their creativity and not be so self-critical, and be very disciplined and very demanding of yourself, and be very highly practiced and knowledgeable, But then when it comes time to make something, to really kind of let your pen flow.
Yeah, I think when I spoke with him, we had a similar conversation because I still struggle with this. Okay. Yeah. So is there anything else you want to talk about or add about David?
I think I mean, we could talk about him all day. I mean, then there's people who knew him better than I knew him. I mean, I
Yeah.
just had the good fortune to be able to sit in his studio with him for, about a year. And I mean, at that time too, I mean, I had almost no prospects. I mean, if you graduate from the University of Montana with a degree in music composition and you're living in Missoula, Montana, there's not a lot of work to be had. And there was something about meeting him and seeing that he could do that. He could live there and he could make a living. But also just seeing how hard he worked to do that. And he definitely helped me get into graduate school, all those sorts of things that, could very easily be impossible if you're from a rural area like that. And he did that for a lot of young composers in Montana, actually. There are several others that I know that were able to go to graduate school and do things like that because he helped them. And yeah, it's just a tremendous loss because he was such an incredibly giving spirit.
Yeah,
And it's just
kind and
very
generous.
admirable.
Yeah, when I think of him, kind and generous are the words that come to mind. Just
Yeah.
all right. So, Chris, we've talked a lot about David, and you mentioned that you're from Montana. So, how did you get your musical start?
My musical start. That's a good question. So I grew up in a small town about an hour north of Missoula, Montana, and there's not a lot of musical activity there. Fortunately, I grew up in a household where my parents listened to a lot of music. I mean, they were listening to classic stuff like Simon and Garfunkel, things like this, not necessarily classical music. But I guess my sort of formal training into instrumental music started when I was in fifth or sixth grade, like a lot of kids, and I, took up the trombone to play in the band. Had a very great junior high band teacher named Chris Rost, who is now, I think, like an EMT or something like that. The education system's a little tough to survive in Montana as far as making a living, and he introduced us, to Holst and Copeland and these things. And I remember purchasing cassette tapes of that music, and it's still some of my favorite music. I mean, Copeland probably still is one of my all-time favorite composers. And so studying trombone and band, and then studying trombone through high school and band. I eventually picked up the guitar when I was a freshman in high school. And that's probably the instrument I took the most seriously, wanting to play rock music. I got very into rock and heavy metal and playing in bands, and that's probably where the real passion developed for music. And then, alongside that, playing in wind ensemble and jazz band and pep band and those sorts of things. So when I went to the University of Montana after that, and I was thinking about being a math major or something like that. I mean, the University of Montana is sort of a place that a lot of Montanans go as a sort of high school extension. It's not necessarily, I mean, I think it's the only school that I even applied to. And honestly, it's one of those places that some people, I don't even know if they apply. I think you can kind of just go. And a lot of my friends did this. And so it has it's a real kind of chill kind of party atmosphere. It's a lot of people just sort of figuring things out. Fortunately, it was a very inexpensive place to go, so it wasn't a huge investment to try to go figure this out. But I just went to the music school on a whim. They didn't have a guitar teacher, which is what I wanted to study, and fortunately, I had played the trombone, so they put me into a trombone studio. Again, this is awesome because I didn't have to audition into the studio, or I didn't have to audition into the program. You could just sign up, and that was great because I had a fantastic trombone teacher. His sister-in-law actually plays in the St. Louis Symphony, which is kind of cool. And so, yeah, just that from that point forward, then once you're in college and in a music school, they sort of put you on a track to take it more seriously. And I did. And I sort of eventually dropped all the rock stuff, in favor of Stravinsky and Ravel and these sorts of things. And started in music ed for a couple of years, and then switched to music composition, maybe my sophomore, junior year, something like that, to start composing. And then from there, just sort of made my way.
So you didn't start composing until you were in college then?
I mean, I wrote songs
Uh huh.
in my bands, and I didn't start. So I think my first piece was like a trombone and piano piece or something, that I wrote for one of my friends there when I was either a sophomore or junior. I'm not sure what year in school I was.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a similar experience. I was music ed, and then I wrote my first piece as a sophomore in college. Switched to general music, got a master's in composition, and then I went back and taught, ironically enough.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. Same kind of story.
That's cool.
Yeah. So after Montana and after your year studying with David, you went to the Cincinnati Conservatory?
Yes. I went to the Cincinnati Conservatory because, I mean, this is how little I knew about the field of composition, because there is a CD of David's music that they recorded that I had. That was literally all I knew about the program. I thought, oh, this seems to be a music school with good musicians, because they put out a CD of Maslanka's music, so I better apply to go to school there, and that's why I went. Fortunately, had a really great composition teacher there by the name of Michael Fide, who became and still is a good friend. So I had a really great experience there. And also, it's just a huge music conservatory, so there's tons of students around and tons of opportunities for composers to make friends and write pieces and do orchestra readings and all that sort of stuff, which was, that was really probably my real beginnings as far as taking composition really seriously.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so then you went to Cornell for your doctorate?
Yeah, so I stumbled across Stephen Stuckey's book on Lutoslawski when I was a graduate student at Cincinnati, and I immediately fell in love with his writing and just his way of talking about music and explaining Lutoslawski's music. And so that was my goal. Maybe in my second year of my master's, I said I have to study with this guy, and so I went about trying to put together, just the best portfolio and all that stuff that I could to try to get to Cornell. And fortunately, that worked out. That's probably one of the luckiest moments of my whole existence as a composer, was getting to study with Stuckey, because he was such a remarkable person.
I didn't even make the connection that Stuckey passed away also. You've had a little bit of...
Yeah, last February, I believe. It does seem as if, it's definitely sad, and it's very strange that both teachers, fortunately I have many great teachers, but it's definitely been kind of a sad and very introspective couple of years. When your teachers pass away, they sort of take on this new position in your mind. And for me, I'm always thinking about what my teachers think about what I'm writing. And then when you have no longer that ability to send them your work, they sort of become these weird metaphorical sort of creatures in your subconscious that sit on your shoulder and that talk to you while you're writing. And I consider myself very lucky to have been able to study with these people, but it's really sad that they're no longer around.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use that analogy, because I had never thought of it that way. But yeah, as I think about my teachers who have passed away, it's the same kind of idea.
Yeah.
So while you were at Cornell, you ran across one of my previous podcast guests, Cynthia Johnston Turner.
Oh, yeah. Cindy's great.
Yeah, she was a wonderful guest. She was, episode 10. I hope she forgives me for forgetting the number, but she was a terrific guest. So I want to talk to you about your music. You write for a variety of ensembles, and you have one piece for band or more than one?
I have, I guess you could say, let's look back here. The first large ensemble piece that I wrote with David was for wind ensemble.
I see.
And I remember I only had a reading of it at the University of Montana, but he came to the reading, which made the students very serious. He helped me a lot with that. Actually, that's funny. I'm going to have to go dig that up, because, wow, that's wild. Anyway, I hadn't thought about that in a long time, but that's what I worked on with him primarily. So I have that piece. I have another piece that I wrote for orchestra that I transcribed for band when I was in Cincinnati, and then I have a piece called Augenblick, which is probably the piece that's been performed the most of mine for wind ensemble, that I wrote for Cindy's group when she was at Cornell. And I have a piece from last year or 2 years ago which is for like a large chamber winds ensemble with solo oboe and electronics and video, which is basically a wind ensemble piece as well, just a slightly smaller wind ensemble, more like a kind of David Gillingham Waking Angels instrumentation.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts about writing more for wind ensemble?
Yeah, I actually try to do it, once every couple of years. First of all, I actually like the wind ensemble. I mean, it's something that I enjoy writing for a lot. I mean, I shouldn't say that like it's a surprise, but I mean, there are some factions of composers who don't like writing for the wind ensemble. And I think that's mainly because it's actually just hard to write for. It's a complex sound. And I like working with bands. I mean, I grew up playing in bands. Those were my formative experiences in high school and college, was playing in the wind ensemble. So it just presents a particular challenge to write for. I mean, I have tons of friends still who are band directors and that sort of thing. So it's a community that I'm also still close to just socially. And I don't have any plans, although there have been a couple of, I've had a couple of discussions with a couple of people about writing another piece, but I'm trying to, at this stage, it has to be sort of down the road, maybe in a year or two. But I do have in the back of my mind wanting to write a large band piece. But anyway, that's still sort of
If I have any college directors listening, I would encourage you to contact Chris. Start a consortium. Yeah. He's a terrific composer. There's your plug.
Thanks, Mark. I'll give you half the proceeds.
Half? I was shooting for 65, but that's fine. I'll take half. So you want to talk about other projects you're working on outside of the band world? I know that you just finished the music for a film. It's being released soon.
Yeah, so that was kind of a random experience, but a very interesting one. Last summer, I wrote music for a film, and I was brought in, totally randomly. One of my very good friends from Cincinnati, actually, is a composer named Tyler Walker, and he has made his way into music supervision in films. And so he got this job working on a film called Novitiate, which is a sort of interesting title about novice nuns in a convent in the 1960s, and he's basically helping them place sourced music and write contracts and do all that stuff for placing pre-existing music in the film. And towards the end of the stages of the film, the director decided they wanted some original music, and so he said, well, you should just, hire my friend, because we have to have this finished in like a week. And so we don't have that much time to go scouting people. And so they said, okay, here's the scenes, go for it. And literally, I'm trying to think of how much. I think my music plays for maybe 20, 25 minutes or something like that in the film. And we literally had to write and record all that music in a week, which was insane and something I'm not sure I would ever do again. But
is it synthesized or is it live recording?
Live recording. So we had to write it all, make all the scores and parts, fly to Nashville, and
rehearse it,
record it with live musicians. They have incredible studio stuff happening in Nashville right now for that sort of thing. So it was really cool. And the film will be out in October. And so far, it seems to be doing okay. It played at Sundance, and it's going to play at the Toronto International Film Festival in a couple of weeks.
Man,
seems to be doing
awesome.
Well.
That is so cool.
Yeah, totally random project, but somehow lucked out that it's actually going to get some screen time.
Well, we put ourselves in a position to be lucky. So
that's true. This one, I think, is the most lucky I've ever been. But
yeah. So do you want to talk about, you have done some work for electronics. You mentioned earlier, and I listened to your piece, Velocity Meadows. Mm-hmm. And that one seems to be, it's a really great piece. Do you want to talk about maybe your use of electronics with the ensemble? Because that's something that a few other composers do, notably Stephen Bryant and Alex Shapiro. And so I'm kind of thinking about, what's your process for adding electronics to an acoustic ensemble?
It's a good question. And yeah, I have heard many times actually Stephen Brandt's music with the ensemble, and also Alex Shapiro's, which is great. And I think it just brings a really interesting quality to the ensemble. I mean, the sort of popular reference point for most instrumental music right now is probably in films and video games. I mean, it's an assumption I'm making, but it seems to be that's what most people seem to say when they kind of approach a composer and ask what they do and say, oh yeah, that's like in a film score or video games.
You and I both know, having taught college, that young people who want to compose look at that first. I want to write film scores. I hear that more than any other question.
Yeah, I think just that's where it exists in in the popular culture. That's kind of where instrumental music exists. But the interesting thing about that is it's a mixed kind of bulked up version of instrumental music, and it's not necessarily anymore that tied to the actual concert experience of music. But that said, I think it could more be tied to that sort of sonic experience. I personally really like the sort of impact of the sound in a movie theater. And I think that impact is possible with a few kind of like subtle, highlights with electronics. Like, for example, yesterday I just went and saw this new movie Dunkirk, and there's a part towards the end. I don't know if this is a spoiler, where they play some Elgar, but it's like a really like beefed up Hans Zimmered out version of Elgar. And I remember thinking, like, that sounds so crazy to me to hear this piece that I've heard a million times on CDs and on the stage, put through this kind of like film music filter where all the bass strings are like 10 times louder and the horns are like 100 times louder and like all this sort of stuff. And I was like, I like that concept. And I remember hearing this in an Alex Shapiro piece, actually, like these big, deep bass sounds that kind of make the ensemble sound like twice as big. And I think there's just a visceral experience that's like kind of waiting to be had with the inclusion of this stuff. I mean, even people like John Adams, who has a lot of his music performed by the St. Louis Symphony, they just did this giant gospel of his, the Gospel According to the Other Mary, and it's this 2.5 hour long piece, and there's an electric double bass in it. And the electric double bass is being amplified with 2 subwoofers on each side of the stage. And so every time you hear a double bass note, you get that same sensation that you get from the movie theater, that the room just sounds huge and heavy. And so it's even happening in the orchestral world. But that's something I think is really exciting about the prospects of adding technology, which is now, like super cheap and easy to use. And the reason the wind ensemble could be on the forefront lines of that is that they're willing to try out experiments. They have the time and the energy to try out new kinds of experiments. And so in Velocity Meadows, I wanted to try, some of these bass sounds to try to get the ensemble to sound bigger, because it was a chamber winds ensemble. There's some delay things, lots of delay effects in the oboe to try to make the room again sound a little bigger, a little more cavernous. But basically, just to try to bring some of that visceralness that we get from current pop culture instrumental music into the concert hall, which is not that difficult to do.
Yeah, I'd also like to see this with more younger ensembles too. I'd like to see publishers take the risk to put some electronic pieces out there for young kids too, because I think they could really latch onto it. We talk about giving kids that visceral experience, like you mentioned. That's a way to do it, and a way to kind of connect them to other aspects of their education and their world around them.
Totally. Absolutely. I have not seen any schools scoff at the idea of adding more technology to any curriculum. So I think it makes perfect sense.
Chris, what advice would you give to young composers? If there's someone out there listening who either has a student who wants to be a composer, or maybe is thinking about getting into it themselves, what advice would you give them to start out at the very beginning?
Yeah, let's see here. I mean, I do have students where I teach, and I think about this question a lot, and I usually end up with a couple of recurring points, and that's, one is to have as much knowledge of repertoire as you possibly can. Most of the composers I know who I admire and who I meet who go on to be successful have an insane amount of knowledge about repertoire. And that's something that's like fairly easy to acquire, actually. That's just time. You just have to sit down and listen to music and listen with scores and just basically be a sponge for musical material. I think you can't really know who you are as a composer unless you've just seen how much stuff there is out there to know. So I would say listen as much as possible and try to listen intently. I mean, listening with a score helps to do that, to focus. But so repertoire knowledge, just listening to anything and everything you can get your hands on. And that doesn't mean just, band music or classical music. I mean, everything you can listen to. The more you can listen to, the better. Secondly, I would say try to be as good as you can possibly be on an instrument. So study an instrument seriously. I think it's very difficult to understand how to write great music if you don't know what it is that the musicians are playing that's great. If you haven't experienced that feeling of, okay, I'm finally playing at the point where I feel like I'm expressing something beautiful on this instrument, and trying to then understanding that as a composer and translating that to in your music. I think that those are probably the two most important things. Just try to play an instrument as well as possible and listen to as much music as possible. Yeah,
there are recurring bits of advice over the course of the podcast episodes, and those two seem to come up a lot. I often say that I wake up every morning and I listen to a piece of music. I try to do that in the first part of my day, every day of my life, something new. And
that's great.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of my discipline of being a composer, because you have to know what's around you. And I get in analogies here, and it's your show. But
no, it's good.
I had a piano teacher between my undergraduate and graduate studies. He was from Germany. He was from Munich during the Second World War, and he was a very thoughtful man and a great piano teacher. And I remember bringing the Debussy String Quartet to him, and like kind of wide-eyed and like, this is an amazing piece. I just discovered it or just revisited it. And I asked him, so can you help me understand this? And he looked at me thoughtfully, and he said, you were spooning out the ocean with a teaspoon. And what he meant is that I had a lot more to do, and that my teaspoons would eventually add up to something, but they weren't adding up yet.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Cool. Yeah. That I always remember that. So listening to a piece every morning is my teaspoon.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good analogy. And that discipline idea, I think, is really important too. I think that's actually the hardest one to convince people of or to teach. But I mean, it's developing a routine or a discipline, and that's actually something I worked with David on all the time. We worked on my process more than we worked on notes.
Isn't that what the great teachers do, though?
Yeah.
He gave you the tools to be successful on your own without him.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's it's really hard to develop discipline later in life. I think if you're working on it at a younger age, it's a lot easier to do.
Yeah, I'd agree. Okay, so what's your favorite work for wind ensemble?
That is a good question. I have a couple that are my favorites. But the wind ensemble has sort of all these different threads, so it's difficult to say which is, like, for example, I really love Emblems by Aaron Copland, but that's almost of a different ilk than some of the other stuff I like. I mentioned earlier Waking Angels by David Gillingham. I really love that piece. I love In the Mountains Rising Nowhere by Joseph Schwantner. I love David's Fourth Symphony, In Memoriam. There's movements of his later symphonies that I think make the wind ensemble sound more impressive and nimble than anything I've ever heard for the wind ensemble. Other pieces I really love by the wind ensemble. Yeah, those are probably the ones I keep returning to when I'm trying to glean some inspiration when I'm writing.
All right, so we may have touched on this already, but do you have any advice that you would give to your 20-year-old self if you could turn back the clock and whisper in your ear?
I would probably tell myself to play more piano. I think that's the thing that I'm finding I need the most.
Yeah, that's simple. Play more piano.
Get better at the piano.
Yeah, well, certainly. All right. So you have lots of things going on right now. What would you like to share or promote or tell the audience about?
Let's see. That's a good question, too. What is coming up here? Well, I guess if you have a chance to go see this film, it'll be out in October, called Novitiate. It'll probably play at your local kind of indie movie house, but that would be cool to see. I don't know if anybody listens from St. Louis, but a couple of performances coming up in September at Wash U and at the World Chess Hall of Fame later in the month, which should be kind of cool because there's a big chess exhibition going on right now in St. Louis with all the top chess players in the world. And there's the Chess Hall of Fame. Many people don't know this, but it has also an art gallery attached to it, which we did some kind of sound installations for. And then we're composing some pieces that will be done at a concert later in September. So people could check that out. I guess just looking ahead down the road, trying to get some stuff released on well, actually hoping vinyl and digital through actually the University of Georgia Wind Ensemble. So Velocity Meadows we recorded, and I'm still working on editing together or mixing basically right now, and I'm that we're hoping will come out possibly actually on vinyl, which should be cool, and on digital. So you keep an eye out for that too.
Cool. Well, Chris, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it and your thoughts about David and talking about your own career. I'm sure that you'll run across the band world soon enough again.
Yeah, hopefully. And thanks to you, Mark, for having this podcast and for talking to me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure.